Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Reconnection podcast with Lynn and Jordan. Today, we are going to talk about Chinese medicine, which is totally where we have a lot of passion and a lot of pride because we are both doctors of Chinese medicine and acupuncturists. And so today we're going to dive into one of our favorite topics about Chinese medicine, which is the five elements. And it is a foundation of Chinese medicine. It is a framework that we use to understand the body, the mind, the spirit. And today we're going to dive deep into it and go into many different topics on it. So, Jordan, let's begin to talk about how we even got to Chinese medicine because this is our first episode on Chinese medicine. And I think it makes sense to just start there. Like, how did we get to this medicine? And I honestly feel like sometimes the medicine calls us in. So, what was happening in your life when you found Chinese medicine?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of these stories I tell so many times that it's almost become like fantasy to me at this point. Let me like actually go back and remember what was going on during that time. So my undergraduate studies was in biochemistry. It's something that always interests me because science was kind of my forte. Chemistry was something that's very interesting. And I kind of always wanted to do medical research, believe it or not. And
Mm-hmm.
organic chemistry is one of those classes you have to take as a bio major or a chemistry major. And it's one of those ones that like made everyone like freak out, but it was like one of the few times where I actually felt like things made sense. Like organic chemistry, I absolutely loved. And because I'm dyslexic, and also it gave me a superpower as well, because organic chemistry, you had to see things like rotating in space and how they operated in space, and like everything already rotates for me in space. So it was like, wow, this is some place where my this becomes a superpower. And so as I was going into biochemistry research, I soon realized that research wasn't what it might have been led to be. I had chatted a few doctors of biochemistry, chemistry, biology, all of the above, and most of research consisted of begging for money or grants, watching test tubes spin for hours, and it very seldomly involved actually utilizing your brain and doing fun things. And then you were also kind of, privy to the man, if you will, and what could actually be researched. There was very little creative freedom there, which is still something that is a gripe of mine. It's still an issue. But anywho, so at that time, I was about a senior in my program, kind of feeling a little bit down about that because this was like my trajectory and I kind of didn't know where else to go. And at the time, I was actually seeing an acupuncturist who was right off my campus of undergrad for mostly like anxiety, depression type things, but also I had some GI issues, including Crohn's slash celiacs. And I think there was just a time where I was sitting on the table and having a conversation with her, and where she was explaining something theoretical to me that was going on, weaving the TCM and the Western medicine. And I was just kind of had that like aha moment of like, this is how my brain works. This is kind of a discipline that like it greatly interests me. I was a huge, Avatar: The Last Airbender nerd growing up, and then it turned into Legend of Korra. They both utilized a lot of the mentality of what Chinese medical theory was, which I was mind blown to see once I started looking into it a little bit. And there was also an episode where one of the characters was getting acupuncture. And I think watching that episode like live, I think it was like this moment where it's like, all right, done deal. Thank you, universe, for the sign. This is what we're doing. Let's go explore. And the rest was history from there. And for me personally, like I said, I was suffering from Crohn's slash celiacs. And in that like year to 2 year time, I went from being, waking up every morning in gut wrenching pain, not being able to consume or eat anything, to about a year and a half later having zero signs of either of the diseases. So, not only was it because of the passion, because of the art, because of all the things that I feel like my life literally prepared me for TCM, but it was also the effects that it showed in me. That was very cool. And last but not least, before I have you share, I also think that growing up, ironically, in Central New York was also preparing me for TCM this entire time, because TCM is a medicine based on observing the outside and seeing how it's internalized. And since I experienced like harsh winters, bad rain, all of these different elements of the external, and I know how that affects us physically. Like your joints start hurting when it starts to rain. When it gets cold, your skin gets dry. Like you just know all these things inherently. That it was literally teaching me TCM as I grew up, which is also another cool aspect that I was able to connect.
You sharing about your journey, and it lights up a lot of things for me because I think in many ways we're all called to this medicine through, our own bodies and our own experiences. And from my perspective, I grew up as a young child with my mother like sharing with me what heat was doing in my body. She would tell me like, this is what heat is doing, this is what wind is doing, you have too much cold in your body. And when I was a kid, I always was sick. Like I always got like colds and
Mm.
flus. I had asthma early on in my life and would use an inhaler all the time. I remember going to the doctor quite a lot. Um, and I just remember always like receiving medicine in the form of herbs, in the form of food, in the form of gua sha. And that early on in my life was like, it was embedded, And so I learned quickly that medicine is expansive beyond what we learn about in not what we learn about in Western medicine. It is so much more into these traditional ways of thinking and the wisdom that we learn about in Chinese medicine and in many other traditions as well. And so, fast forward into my life, I
Can I interject a quick
got,
question there before you go on?
yeah, yeah.
So I actually have a lot of friends and people around me that, grew up in the way that you just stated. And
hmm
actually all of them kind of resented the medicine because they grew up in it. Did you not have that experience?
You know what? No, I didn't. And I understand, like, I've heard similar perspectives of people like kind of shying away from the medicine and thinking, like, oh no, I don't want to do that because I was like just surrounded by that when I was a kid. But I think for me, I sort of thought as a kid, I was like, this is so weird. Like, mom stopped talking to me about this stuff. But I also remember that it worked and it made me feel much better. And I have
Mm.
memories of me feeling like so cared for and some things that like I remember my mom doing was when I used to have like really bad coughs or like have asthma attacks, my mother would do gua sha like on my chest, like on my rib cage. It would hurt so bad. But after I did that, and I don't know if it's just like the placebo effect and me just experiencing care from my mom, but I just felt so much better. And I think I learned quickly that, oh, this works. And this is a part of life. And so fast forward, when I wanted to go into pre-nursing, I quickly learned like that's not what I want to do. I'm not meant to work in a hospital, but I am here on this planet to help people. And I went through a whole like identity crisis during that time. And I also really struggled with like, I was having a lot of like hormonal imbalance and had a lot of like acne growing up and even like into my adulthood and really struggled with my self-confidence during that time. And I ended up going into a completely different field of work, which was like cybersecurity and tech, which is complete opposite of like what I'm doing now. And then, that kind of told me at that time like I really didn't know who I was or what I wanted. And then I later realized that I think I had told this story before, but I had contracted this like ulcer in my eye and then almost went blind. After that, I had my mom come and support me during that time, and she brought me to an acupuncturist, and something clicked in me where I was like, this is what I'm here to do. Like, I'm here to learn what this guy is doing, and I know this already. Like, this is already in me. And then like 2 weeks after that, I went to Chinese medicine school. Like, I got enrolled, I started class. Like, it just like boom, 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 all happened like so quickly. And then I learned about my body and I learned about energy from my Chinese medicine perspective. And it all just clicked. Like it's all been like remembering. And whether it was from my childhood or even beyond that, because, I am part Chinese, 25% Chinese, and like I have that ancestry, and a lot of ancestors that are in from Vietnam, like a lot of their ancestors are from China, right? A lot of people migrated, and there's lineages tied to Chinese culture and to Chinese roots. And so for me, it was just like a remembrance, like, oh yeah, I know how to work with energy. I
Yeah.
know about the five elements. Like I know about the like different pathogens and like wind, because early on in my life I received that information. Like my mom would always be like, cover your neck and make sure when you go outside, don't like, it's windy, so, wear jackets and you do all the weird things, cover your feet and all this stuff when you're sleeping. Don't wash your hair at night. Don't sleep with a wet hair, with the window open. Like all those things I kind of learned quickly early on, and it was
Mm,
just like embodied. And so once I started practicing the medicine and giving it to other people, I had a full circle moment of me being like, yeah, this is what I'm here to do. Like, and if anything, Chinese medicine is just a foundation of it and is my roots. And so it's amazing to be able to like, teach people about Chinese medicine and teach them a new paradigm of looking at their body. Because oftentimes people come to us, I'm sure you've experienced this, Jordan, where they're like, this is my last resort. I've tried everything. I've tried the Western medicine things, but yet nothing is working. And then when we start to talk to them about their body from a Chinese medicine perspective, they're like, light bulbs start to come on, because they're like, oh, right, this is something my body already does. Chinese medicine is just telling us the natural process of our body, the natural functions of our body and what it does from a different language, a different way of thinking, a different culture. And so when we give them that kind of understanding, something lights up, because we inherently know the wisdom of our body. Like it's already happening. We just don't think about it in that way. And so I think it's been a really amazing journey to come back to Chinese medicine and to base a lot of the work I'm doing now on it. And I think one of my favorite parts is talking about the five elements of Chinese medicine, because it acts as this framework of the body. And I want to ask you, Jordan, how you integrate using the five elements, and maybe from your perspective, what the five elements is, how you use it. And I know that your practice is called the Elements of Health, right? So let's dive a little bit into that.
no, absolutely, and I think that just to reiterate something you stated, it's funny that for me, I of course it wasn't having the upbringing that you had and that background knowledge of the information, but for me, I almost felt lazy through acupuncture school, for lack of a better word, because so much
Yes.
of the framework and understanding and the philosophy was a remembering for me. It was just like a
Mm-hmm.
duh, like that's just how things work. It was very commonsensical. And don't get me wrong, that's because the medicine itself is just the inherent use of common sense, but it is
Mm-hmm.
something that is a framework that most of us weren't typically given. And I think that I was just
Right.
privileged enough to kind of come up with adjacent things throughout my life, which kind of gave me that. And for me, so the five elements, you know, Chinese medicine theory is based on yin and yang, of course, which I see is just a way of contrast and understanding the body and physiology and obviously the outside world as well. And I see the five elements of just a further extension or elaboration on that. So the yin and yang being the separation of the two, and then the five elements kind of being the separation of the five, so we can compartmentalize and organize things a little bit better. And I think the importance about both the yin and yang and the five elements, these aren't just applicable theories and frameworks for physiology and for the body. They're also applicable frameworks for the external world and the environment and the way that we live.
Mm-hmm.
They also can be applied to the times of the day. They can be applied to every process, I guess, and every foundation. That I think it's what really gives them strength, is that they are simply a framework. They can be overlaid on almost anything. So therefore, they don't contradict Western physiology. They don't contradict what Western medicine has to say. They're just a framework for analyzing and understanding and kind of looking at those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I do agree that Chinese medicine, and when we're talking about the five elements, it's very inclusive, and it's talking about of relationship essentially, and that all things have connections to the other, and that we live in this sort of interconnected web of systems and relationship and communication, and that's what's happening inside of our body. I always relate it to like an ecosystem. Like inside of our body is an
Mm,
ecosystem of our organs, of you can say there's like, plants and animals, which are our cells and our organelles and our muscles. Like all of these different
mm,
aspects within our body are creating systems that just speak to each other and communicate. When we experience like imbalance in our body, or maybe, health conditions, is when certain things are not communicating properly. Like, for example, if we have, let's say our fire element is out of balance, and that's not properly speaking to the earth element, which comes after the cycle. And so when we think about this framework, maybe we can even include like a photo of what it looks like, the five element cycle, but we have to look at the shape of like a circle, and that these elements, they are in relationship and what we call the generating cycle. And so we have the mother that creates the sun. So we can start with, let's say, the fire creates earth, and earth creates metal, metal creates water, water creates wood. And so it continues on this cycle. And then that also is created, that framework is created based on nature's patterns. So the ancient Taoists and the ancient practitioners of this medicine were looking at nature to start to create this understanding of what was happening inside of our bodies. And that's something that fascinates me so much. It's like
mm,
we can just look outside and observe what's happening in the weather and the seasons to start to understand how energy is actually moving, right? We have the different season shifts, summer going into fall, fall going into winter, winter going into spring, and so on. It's like creating that cycle of the five elements already happening. And then within that circle, we have something called the co-cycle, which is essentially it's a checks and balance system. So like each element is connected to another. We call it the grandmother, that helps to rebalance the energies when maybe there's a little bit of energy going too far off into one side or onto another side. And so it's always this like checks and balance system. And what I've learned about nature and an ecosystem, especially like when we look at a garden, there's always something in nature that helps to check and balance the other thing. Like, so for example, I live in Costa Rica, and I'll talk to my partner and we'll say, "Oh wow, there's a lot of like, ants, right, in this part of like the farm." And he'll tell me like, "Well, let's just wait a little bit, because oftentimes nature has a solution, and we usually don't need to interfere too much.
mm.
We just need to kind of maybe facilitate the shift, but usually we don't." And maybe in a few weeks or maybe in a few months, that problem will actually resolve itself naturally through like the inner workings of life, whether it's raining a lot or other animals come in to check and balance the system. But that happens inside of our bodies as well. Jordan, I want to give you some space if you want to add anything here.
No, I think that that was beautifully presented and beautifully said, and I think that it's important to understand because a lot of people, who might not be privy to these types of theoretical understandings, it can kind of be like, well, then how can understanding the outside really give us this framework and understanding of the inside? And people kind
Mhm.
of forget we really separate the body often and ourselves from the external, from the outside world, from all of these things. And we often forget that the same laws of physics, the same laws of thermodynamics, of biology, of chemistry that apply to the outside world, they all apply in here too. Like we aren't some separate entity that has this new sets of rules, these new sets of laws, these new sets of way things operate. We are
Right.
utilizing the same principles and theories and aspects. So that's why understanding the outside world can so easily help understand what's going on inside, because they operate based off the same rules. And I
Mhm.
think that that's really important for us to understand when we look at these frameworks, because again, I think we have this preconceived notion that the human body is something different or separate or unique, And yes,
Right.
we're unique and special in many types of ways, but not always. We do
Right.
still operate by the same principle of the outside world. And I think this is a great place to segue into, utilizing those five elements to kind of give a basic understandings of how they are seen in the external world and then kind of how they're applied to physiology. So I guess
Mhm.
I'll start off with starting with fire because I'm a fiery person and I enjoy it. And it's
Yeah.
also the time of the year that we're transitioning into because fire is representative of the summertime of the year. And from a Chinese medicine standpoint, since it's associated with the summertime of the year, since it's fire itself, it's representative of heat as well, and heat, how heat utilizes and operates in the body. The organs associated, because each of these elements is associated with systems in the body and how they operate, is the small intestine and the heart. There's also the pericardium and the Sanjiao, which we could probably spend an entire podcast talking about pericardium and Sanjiao. So let's keep their
Yeah.
explanation a little bit brief since they are quite theoretical. But if we look at just the heart, the pericardium, which it's surrounding, and then the small intestines, how I've seen that connected to fire is quite interesting, and how I've seen that connected to how we saw the outside world is even more interesting because I know that the heart operates off of electromagnetic frequency, off of electrical impulses and charge. And if we look at the external world, so does our sun, which is the ultimate
Mhm.
ball of fire, if you will, that exists in nature. So I do think that there's a connection to that understanding that by understanding and looking at the sun might have been how we internalized some of this understanding of how the heart operated. And then when we look at the small intestine, and I think you gave me this epiphany actually, or at least connected these thoughts. When we look at the small intestine is largely responsible for reabsorbing electrolytes. And again, electrolytes are responsible for that charge, that electricity, which again can be seen as fire inside the body. So I think that that's how
Mm.
those two organ systems kind of connect to its element itself. And I think that that's how fire kind of operates and is seen from a Chinese medicine perspective. There's so many adjacent things connected to fire in under TCM. How would you say that, even from an emotionality standpoint? Because I know you're really good with the emotional connections. How would you look
Mhm.
at fire and elaborate on what I just stated there?
This is one of my favorite topics, talking about emotions. Well, when we talk about the holistic perspective, right? Chinese medicine is fundamentally holistic. So we're looking at not only the physical, but the mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects. And so when we look at the fire element, we have the heart, the SI, the small intestine, the pericardium, and the Sanjiao. And of course, we're gonna put the Sanjiao and the pericardium off to the side today because that's another juicy conversation, just like what you said. And I'm
Exactly.
sure we'll dive into that sometime. But the heart and the small intestine are they're interconnected with our ability to take in information and filter information, and also, well, let's just say that's our small intestine, because our heart and our small intestine have their own energetics. And what we say in Chinese medicine, they're either a yin or a yang. And we can break that in each of the organs into smaller, more granular things. But when we talk about, let's just say the small intestine, it has this function to sort out and discern between something that we want to keep, like an emotion that we want to keep, or an experience we want to keep, or something like it's kind of, it helps us organize our drawer, right? And when it's out of balance, then it sort of keeps too many things, and it keeps things that maybe we don't really
Mhm.
need inside, right? We don't really need to keep these experiences, or we don't need to hold on to this emotion. And emotions, if we break down its components, if we break down its root, it's energy and motion, right? And so these are just things that emotion is just energy that needs to be flowing through our body rather than things that need to be that's stuck. And so our small intestine really helps us sort through those things and clear those things from the body through elimination, through our urination, which is part of that process of the fire element. And then the heart. The heart is also known as the supreme controller. It's like where our queen, our inner king lives. And so we often don't want emotions to touch the deepest aspects of our heart. Even though I think in many ways it does, like when we experience like joy, like pleasure at its highest peak, like that's going to touch the heart. In fact, we want it to touch the heart because I think that that's what makes us human. That's what makes us feel alive is when we get to feel our emotions so deeply and so intensely that we're like, yeah, I will never forget that moment because of what I felt during that time, right? Um, I think that our heart acts as almost a way, like a receptor of our emotions, of what we're experiencing in our life. And it also helps to kind of um, communicate to all the other aspects of our body that, okay, this emotion needs to be processed out and through. And then this emotion, maybe we put like a bookmark on this emotion and we start to kind of create some understanding and some memories around this. But it's also about processing emotions as well. And so each emotion that our body feels is going to get in touch with the heart. And we can also dive into another episode. But let's move on to the earth element because this is something that we love talking about from a Western perspective, which is the gut health, the digestive system. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, the earth element is the sun and is created after the fire element. And so, how that works is essentially the energy of our heart, the fire of our heart, will influence and activate the digestive fire within our digestive system. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, the earth is related to the spleen, the stomach, and our pancreas. And when we there's different theories on the earth element, in that the more ancient traditional understanding of the earth was in the middle of the cycle, and it was this point of contact that each element, each time we had an energetic shift, our body would get in touch with our earth element, our body would get in touch with our gut. And if you think about that from how we experience our gut in the modern day, it's like we ask ourselves, well, what is your gut saying? Right? When we're making like big decisions,
Mhm.
or, what did that make you feel in your solar plexus, in your abdomen? We always ask ourselves, and we do this kind of check with ourselves, especially intuitively, because our gut communicates to all the other aspects of ourselves. And actually, when we think about on a physical level, physiological level, our what we bring inside of our body, the food, the nutrients, the nourishment, that's going to create the chi that we're going to experience and feel every day, and thus influence our actions, right? And so I want to give some space to you, Jordan, if you want to add more on the earth element.
No, absolutely. And I think that one of the most important things to add about the earth element was something that I intuitively had one day when, just going for a walk in nature as I do. And, I tried to understand again all of these elements and how they did relate to the outside and how those might have been internalized when someone was trying to come up with this concept. And I think the
Mm-hmm.
earth element is one of the more obvious and on the nose ones, in that when we look at our actual earth, when we look at the actual ground outside, its purpose and the processes it goes through is, yes, it does create and grow things, but its other process is to break things down, to decompose, to
Mm-hmm.
deconstruct and separate and store nutrients. And so I think that
Right.
that's how the connection there was made between the earth system and digestion, because we saw the earth actually digesting life out there and then providing that nutrients for new life. So I think that that's where that connection comes
Mm.
from with the system. And I think
Yeah.
the other important aspect, so again, we have the earth associated then therefore with the outside earth and digestion process. But I like the other aspect of it, being connected emotionally to thought and to worry.
Mhm.
And so when we look at this emotion that's connected to earth being thought and worry, we almost look at this symbolically with the process of digestion and how we digest thought. So the digestion system isn't only responsible for digesting the food and things that we consume, but it's also responsible for digesting and processing the things we're mentally thinking about. And this seems really abstract at first, but then we also look now at Western medicine saying that, so much of our serotonin, so much of our communication, so much of our thought processes might actually be happening inside the gut. So this becomes a lot less ethereal and becomes a lot more practical of a sound thing right now to accept that some of what thinking is and some of what processing is on a mental emotional level might actually come from our digestive processes. And I think it also
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense with us living in a world right now that's so anxiety ridden and people are so overthinking and people are so tumultuous in thought that I think it makes sense that we have a time where we're seeing more GI system problems than we've ever seen before, whether that be GI cancer or whether that be IBS or whether that be Crohn's disease. I think these things are becoming so prevalent, not only due to the things we're consuming, which I think is playing a huge role, but I think it's also partially due to the fact that we're not processing our thoughts correctly either. And so
Mm.
therefore these two things are kind of feeding into each other and causing this perfect storm of issues with the earth system. So
Yeah.
I think that my note and my takeaway again is loving to see how that was externalized outside and seeing how the earth worked. But secondly, like you said, liking to connect back to the emotion that's associated with, and the emotion associated with earth being worry and thought,
Mhm.
really sits home and makes a lot of sense to that process.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the external reflection of this element happening in nature. It is true that when we watch something decompose or we create compost, that is literally seeing the earth, seeing organic matter turn back into nutrients so we can put it back into the earth. And so our bodies also have that regenerative quality, just like the earth is losing, like the trees lose their leaves, we also lose cells die off, and then that creates more space for new cell growth. And so our body's constantly going through that. And then I also love this aspect of like needing to digest our experiences and our emotions and all the thoughts that we're having. And like when our body is kind of in overdrive of like we're constantly overthinking and we're constantly ruminating, which is a big thing with the earth element, is we find ourselves ruminating, especially right before bed or just throughout our day. We're kind of like in analysis paralysis and we can't really take action because
Mhm.
we're too stuck in our heads. A lot of what's happening is like we need time to really sit and process what is happening on a day-to-day basis, and like giving ourselves time to integrate, giving ourselves time to digest and to kind of allow the process of our body to release things that like we no longer need. I think it comes back to like our intestines being a big part of that, like the discernment of, do we need to hold on to certain
Mm.
emotions or thoughts or things that happen to us? And if our digestive system, let's say like our small intestine is doing that properly, then that allows our earth element to also do that in a way that's supportive to us and doesn't feel so overwhelmed. And I think that's also a part of like our culture too, is like, can we give ourselves more time to just sit and process and be in safe spaces where we can do that together? And that's a whole nother conversation. But let's dive deeper into the metal element because, I know we can dive into these all the elements for so long, but let's dive into the metal element in
No,
that it
absolutely.
belongs to the lungs and the large intestine. And the metal element is an element that comes after earth, and it is inherently connected to our lungs and the air we're breathing. And when we think about it on a physiological level, it's the only organ, our lungs are the only organ that's connected internally to externally. So it's the only one that has interface, well, besides our skin, which is also connected to the metal element. But we have this ability to bring in oxygen, release carbon dioxide, and create the circulation within our body that nourishes our muscles and our brain and our blood and all the aspects, which is vital for physiological health. Like they say that we can survive a few days off of food, no, with no food, but like can only survive a few minutes without air, right?
Mm.
We need oxygen. We need our lungs to be constantly regenerating our bodies and nourishing our bodies. But on a mental and emotional level, our lungs are going to be connected to sadness and grief and sorrow. And that is important for the function of the lung. When we think about breathing in, taking in new inspiration, inspiring, bringing in new chi into our body, it's important for that experience when we're experiencing sadness, grief, depression. It's important for us to have new experiences in our life to um, bring in new energy because it helps to move the energy of the lungs. Um, and then on a spirit level, the are also connected to the Po, which is connected to our ability to feel sensations. It's our sort of our animal
Mm.
soul that's connected to smell, sounds, hearing, taste, touch. And so when we experience the five senses, it wakes this part of ourselves. It wakes the spirit of the lungs and it says, "Oh, I'm alive. Oh, there's something that's awaking my senses. And can I take in this inspiration? And can I release the things that can give more spaciousness for that if need be?" And then our lungs have its other component of the large intestine. And the large intestine also has this ability to, similar to the small intestine, to release out things that we don't need. And it's very much an elimination organ. But it also in the physiological component, it's going to bring in water. It's going to absorb water, sort of like the last resort, right? It's going to absorb as much water as it can and release any impurity and release anything that needs to be released from the body. And Jordan, I want to give you some space to talk about the metal element.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that it's so funny because I know everything for the most part that you just said, but hearing someone reflecting it back to me helps open up so many doors. And I think the
Mhm.
first one that I have to state is so again, we're going back to we started with fire, which is typically seen summertime, that transitions into
Mhm.
earth, which is just the transitional times in general. Then we get to about fall time where we do have the metal element that we're speaking of now. And I think that there's so much reflected not only in the time of the year of fall, but the fall aspect that was related to these organs and also what's going on outdoors. And I think the first thing I will state is when you stated the lung and the exchange of gas, I was like, how is that related to this metal element and also what we see outside, and how did that come from Earth? And it really got me thinking, well, Earth then creates things like trees, and trees are having this gas exchange in this process. So that's how Earth breathes this metal. We almost look at metal, from a really scientific standpoint, we can see metal as just our elements, and we can see it as this gas exchange process that's occurring, and that's how they can be associated with the lungs. And another aspect of something you said to me or said that made me realize the earth is also responsible for decomposing and breaking down. And once we break down substance to its bare minimum, we get down to the elements once again. So that's how we can see the earth then create metal by breaking substances down into their purest form. And that's why once they're broken down in these standpoints, we can utilize them for something else. So that's also how we have this association, therefore, with metal in the large intestine. The large intestine is this final process of things being broken down. And once we get to the large intestine, whatever is left can then be distributed to where it needs to go at its bare
Mhm.
minimum elements at its metal form. So that's how I like to
Mhm.
see the connection between both the lungs and the large intestine and metal itself. Once again, we said that metal is associated with grief, and we also that's associated with the time of the year of fall. I think how we can
Mhm.
see this, across the board. It's interesting culturally. We always sense that fall is related to death, and death is actually the ultimate form of grief, if you will. If we look
Yeah.
at American traditions of Halloween being in the fall, Mexican traditions of Day of the Dead, if we look at
Mhm.
European traditions of Samhain, if we look at all across the world, we see that in this fall time, we have this celebration of death, understanding of death, and processing of death, which is the ultimate
Mhm.
form of grief. And I think that's why this time of the year, being associated with metal, being associated with these organ systems, is so important. And if we don't take care of that healthily, that's when pathology occurs. I think it's no coincidence that, the fall time of the year is the time of the year we sometimes see, colds break out or things with the lungs or issues here. Because again, we
Mhm.
have that connection to that system. And last but not
Mhm.
least, one of the most healing and soothing things for grief and for the system is crying. That's how we release grief. And
Mm.
when you've had a good cry, you do the, you have the deep breaths.
Yes.
And I think it's those lungs like truly like getting out those things. And it's that process actually taking full way. So, there's so many integral connections to how we see
Mhm.
this metal connection, not only to the previous element of earth, but the metal connection to the time of the year of what is fall, this connection to
Mhm.
grief, and this connection to these organ systems. And I think last but not least is something we didn't talk about is the pathology somewhat associated with the times. And with
Mhm.
metal element, it's the sense of dryness getting into the body. And we all know
Yes.
that with fall being windy, you can kind of see that happening as well. But we can also just see dryness is a negative pathology for the system of the lungs, the skins, and the large intestine, because if these things are not kept moisturized, that's when we start to see pathology with them. So again, that's a connection
Mhm.
of how to take care of these systems is moisture in its appropriate domains there. But other than
Yeah.
that, I think you just did a really good job of just, volleyballing off of my thoughts and where I was going there.
Yeah.
And I think that that really encompasses what metal is. And I think
Yeah.
this is a great transition as we transition from fall, the metal element, into the winter element of water. And again, how we see, metal create water. I think the analogy we're always given is like, you see condensation on the outside of metal, so that's how metal creates water. And I guess it works. Didn't really ever really work for me, but that's just what we're going to understand, that metal does create water. And with water, we get to the most like on the nose relationship with the external world, I think, and the symbology of water. Water is associated with the kidneys and the urinary bladder, both things that process water and urine. I don't think we need to think too hard about what that connection is. I think what we do need to think is on the deeper level, the understanding of the mental emotional aspect of water, the mental emotional aspect of the kidneys, and that sits with this base primal understanding of what fear is. And I think that this
Mhm.
connection is so obvious because the kidneys do hold the adrenal glands, the fear response glands. So I don't think it's even that hard of a connection to make from a Western physiology standpoint, but I think it's really important to speak further upon water, its relation to fear, its relation to winter, which it's interesting because winter, even especially if you're in Central New York, is a fearful time of the year. So I actually
Mhm.
asked for your deeper understanding of what the water element means to you from this emotional,
Mhm.
spiritual aspect, because there's also the is water is je, the will, right? Because I think that's
Yeah.
important to connect there too.
Definitely, definitely. I want to note that you brought in the imbalances of the metal element, and we can even speak onto like the summer, which is the fire element. During this time, if obviously it would be heat, right? Like too much heat would be
Yep.
really taxing for the body. So making sure we're taking like cooling herbs, we're really cooling ourselves off, and we're releasing a lot of heat, whether through sweating, exercise, and so be it. And then if we have the earth element, it's also going to be this dampness that can be felt during times like, let's just say, when we have the utmost aspect of summer, which is the fire element. After that time, it gets to this like late summer time where there's like more moisture in the air, there's just more like dampness, and that is an imbalance of the digestive system and the earth element. So when we have just more like sluggishness, heaviness in our digestive system is when we're feeling the dampness. And then going into the water element, the water element, I feel like it's one of the most mystical elements. I mean, all of them are very mystical, but I feel like the water element, the
Well, and
ancient
I think it
Taoist.
just goes with the time of the year. Like winter has such mystery surrounding it because there's just such
Mhm.
quiet and calm, and it's scary but
Yeah.
interesting. It's a
It's
mystical
more
time, I feel.
inwards. Yeah. It's you're being asked, like, if we look at what nature is doing, after fall we lose the leaves, and then wintertime is like you're seeing the trees bare. You're seeing energy and chi life force go so inwards, and it's conserving its energy. And I feel like when we're in the deepest part of winter, that's what we're kind of being asked to do, is go into this more deeper place and be introspective with ourselves, and to look at maybe even into these mysterious places, these dark places within ourselves, that we have to ask, like, is this actually serving me, you know? And if this isn't
Yeah.
serving me, then how can I then shift my energy or reframe this, or kind of do a different action that can come into fruition when the springtime comes. And so a lot of it is like reorganizing, reshifting, being really reflective on your own life, maybe on the past year, on the last seasons, and really figuring out what worked, what didn't work, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, you know. And I think there's a lot of conversation around resources, because when we look at nature, like, its resources are going inwards. It's losing, on quote unquote, losing its resources, but like animals during this time are hibernating. Trees are going more dormant, right? And so we're being asked this primal question of, like, do I have enough resources to get through the winter? Which I think is an ancestral, like, very deep ancestral primal question that is within all of us, and that we ask ourselves on some sort of level during this time, is, do I have enough to get through the winter? Will I survive the winter? Will I survive the going deep within myself? And when we do go deep within ourselves, we're asking ourselves questions that can tap into the roots of our fear. And sometimes that looks like, that is survival. Like, will I survive or will I die? And that's a
Hmm.
very that's a very fearful question. I think fear, like, death is the ultimate thing that we fear, right? And so it's like we're being asked and we're being presented this in our external, and so it makes it just trickles into our external realm, or in our
Yeah.
internal realm, where we're asking ourselves those questions, like, what needs to die off in order for me to have this new spring, right? And so on an emotional level, that's what we're going through. And then let's just bring it into an example, like, if we're experiencing burnout, like, our adrenals are like shot, and we've like really really pushed ourselves throughout this year, through the summertime, through the fall, like, we've really pushed, and our body now is just like, I need to rest. And I we're experiencing maybe symptoms of want to say, like, chronic fatigue, or wanting to sleep a lot, or just like wanting to isolate, and just feeling a lot of fear and paranoia even around our experience day to day. That could be an experience, an imbalance of the water element. When we're experiencing that, we have to, our body is essentially telling us, like, hold on, take a step back, let's reassess, let's reroute, let's see what's working, see what's not working, and reshift. And I think the water element is a great time, like the winter time is a great time to make those deep internal shifts, to really do the deep inner reflections, that when we face our fear, it can create a lot of magic. It could create a lot of,
Yeah.
like, major transformation in our life, which then fuels what spring is going to be like for us. And I do want to say that relates a lot to the Zhe, which is our willpower. It's the spirit of the kidneys. And the spirit of the kidneys, when we use our willpower, we can essentially have something in our heart and our mind and our body and say, I want to create this thing into the spring. And when we put our heart and our mind and our willpower to that, we will be able to create that. I do want to note that I believe the water is the most yin element of each one of
Mhm.
them. And when we talk about the yin, it's talking about these deeper inner spaces. So we're talking about the subconscious, we're talking about the unconscious, we're talking about our dreams, like what we're experiencing in our dreams. And so we have to be mindful during the winter time of what is coming up in these spaces. What is my subconscious telling myself? Because we can do a lot of change. They say that 85% of our behaviors, actually, I think it's 95%. That's a big shift. 95% of behaviors are being influenced by our subconscious, which is inherently
Hmm.
connected to our kidneys and by our nervous system, because our nervous system is and our brain is connected to the water element. So we want to make sure that during this time we have some supportive tools to like work through our nervous system, challenges and in our subconscious, like the things that are coming up around um, the fears that are in our subconscious and things like that. So, yeah, I know that was a long spiel on water, but I just feel like it's such an important element that we can't brush over because it's
No,
such a
and I
prominent.
feel like that was very, very, very all encompassing there too. And I think that it triggered a few things in me that I didn't even think about is, this time being so important, of being reflective, of slowing down, of having these moments. I don't think it's
Mhm,
any coincidence because once again I have to look at the external world and what we've done culturally, and it's you look at all
mhm,
major religions usually during the time of December have this self-reflective holiday, whether that be
mhm,
Judaism or Catholicism with Christmas and things along those times of the year being right around the marking of the shortest day of the year, the marking of winter. I think it was important for those holidays to be then because the purpose originally for holiday was to rest and reflect. We've kind of gone away from that, but that was actually the important aspect of it. So we even have culturally these things set up reminding us that we need to slow down, that we need to reflect on what's important. We need to go inward. And I think that we've
mm,
obviously backed away from utilizing these practices for those reasons, but they were set there originally for a purpose because if
mm,
we look at, religion or holiday or tradition for at any standpoint, its original inception was for our overall health. The purpose of practicing these things was to make ourselves as whole as possible. So you can see, no matter what
right,
religion or is reflected in, you can see how these systems were set up, to help you overall. And Chinese medicine as a whole is no different in that it was a framework of utilizing the outside and the inside to reframe your life, your practices, the way you do things to optimize your health and utilize what's naturally occurring. And I think that
right,
that's why I always loved making and connecting all these dots is just because, there's systems that have been set up for eons that we've kind of ignored, kind of just seen as just the norm. And I'm going to have this be our perfect transition from the winter element, from the water element into the wood element, which is spring. Because I think that one of the poor practices of the Western world was utilizing the um, the Gregorian New Year, January, to be our goal setting time and our execution time and our doing time, which is in the middle of winter, the last time you want to actually do so, and kind of coming
right,
back to more traditional things like Western astrology, like Chinese medicine, that actually sees the spring to be the better time
mhm,
for doing these things, the better time for executing these things, because that's what nature
mhm,
is doing. Nature waits until spring to start, really executing these plans. And when we move from water into wood, we move from the kidneys, urinary bladder system into the liver and gallbladder. I think the liver is an organ that's finally getting a lot of attention now. Like we talk about
yep,
liver cleanses, liver this, liver that. And I think it's just becoming forefront again. Whereas I think in Chinese medicine, it always was just a super important organ. Um,
yeah,
I think whenever I talk about the liver, I love because people always like, how are organs associated with emotions? And yeah, how could that work physiology wise? I think the
right,
liver is the easiest one for me to explain to people because it has the association with anger. And we all know somebody that after a few drinks, which clearly impacts the livers, it clearly impacts the liver, they go straight into anger or frustration
yeah,
or rage. And that's just a
mhm,
very, 1-to-1 ratio how we can see this organ system being associated directly with an emotion. And how that's connected back into the spring and the time of the year. We also see that internally when we get into this spring fever, when we get into this time of the year where things are starting to move, if we don't move with them, we do get into anger, frustration, into overload. So we see how all of these things are symbiotically connected. And that takes us to wood, our final element of the day.
Yeah. It's interesting because when talking about emotions, we have to understand that Chinese medicine is giving each one of these organ systems, each one of these elements, they're recognizing that they have an intelligence within themselves.
Mm.
The heart fire has an intelligence within itself. The kidneys have an intelligence. There's the lung brain. They're actually scientifically saying this nowadays, that there's like each organ has its own brain. Each one has its own physiological processing function, executive function to do what it needs to do. And so I do want to honor that on an emotional level, that each one of these organs are supporting and facilitating the expression of the energies that we see as emotions. So the liver is a great example of that because it's connected to anger and it's connected to rage. But I do want to say that there are the other expressions, like everything's on a spectrum. When we have the liver, we have a spectrum of anger, rage, but then the liver also is known for its benevolence. It's known for its ability to have, to spread kindness and want the best for others, and to create things that are constructively supportive to all, right? To the benefit of the good, the benevolence of the liver. And I do want to say that's connected to the spirit of the liver, which is the hun. And we talk about the hun often in Chinese medicine, and that it's connected to, I say the easiest example is connected to the dreams, like a dream state. When we're dreaming and we're really in this like other world while we're dreaming, and we're in a different dimension and we remember the dreams when we wake up, we usually say that's the hun, that's the spirit of the liver that's traveling. And this is an aspect of our liver that in Chinese medicine it honors its connection to other parts, other souls. It's a very spiritual aspect of ourself, but it's also an aspect that's connected to creation, to planning, to future envisioning, and expansion in many ways. And so when we think about physiologically, like our liver is connected to detoxing and cleansing and like processing fats through our gallbladder, but it also is creating spaciousness, right? When we're releasing toxins, it's creating spaciousness for what's authentic, for what our body really needs. Because when we're releasing toxins, we're saying no to the toxins, but saying yes to our body's natural functions and the things, the resources that our body needs. And then when I say we want to talk about like what's happening externally in nature, when we move out of winter time, the kidney time, the water time, all of the insights that we've had in that time, the introspection fuels this this burst of action, this burst of yang energy, which we see in nature as like, we plant the seeds of winter and then you start seeing the sprouts and, little plants popping up and the flowers beginning to bloom during this time. It's like the seeds that we've planted, the inner insights, the realizations we've had are now beginning to bloom and come up to the surface. And in springtime, that's also happening within our bodies, in that when we have this jolt of yang energy, it's sort of like our body waking up first thing in the morning. It's like we have that inner spring after we've waken up from our deep sleep. We have this like revitalization of energy that happens. We also have to understand from a Chinese medicine perspective, the liver is going to be really necessary for all of our qi spreading to all parts of our body. It's responsible for spreading our qi. And when it's in balance is when our qi is not spreading. It's when our qi is kind of stuck in the liver. And so if we have the tools to support ourselves, especially during springtime, especially during like that livery time, which we say, to help move our chi outwards, to help make sure it doesn't get stuck in our body, it doesn't get stuck in one place. We can do exercise, we can really dive into the practices that move our energy and like create that spark, that bloom within us. Then it can help facilitate moving our chi, expanding our plans, expanding our actions, which is so much about what springtime is like. It's a very exciting time. Like every spring, I'm always like, oh my gosh, like I'm so excited for what's to come, and like, I'm so ready to like make connections and put myself out there. Like it's really like you're coming out of the whole of winter and you're like, well, what's new,
This
guys? Like,
actually reminds me of a story that I think is applicable to our overall conversation here, because again,
Mhm,
we're connecting the external world, the seasons, and how they impact us physiology wise. And this might seem like a very abstract concept to some people, but I had a patient once who was a researcher, I think biology researcher, and I don't know exactly what the research, but they said that they were working with mice mainly, and that they did experimentation on mice. That's not the moral of the story, but anyhow, that's what they were utilizing. And they would
mhm,
say that actually, when they would have to move the standard deviation for reproduction that they utilized when it
mhm,
was between the months of April and June. And mind you, so what that meant is that during those months, no matter what the research was on, they had to be reminded that reproduction was going to escalate extremely during that time, just because that's the time it just happened in these mice models.
wow,
And I think the most interesting part, she said that these mice that were being utilized have not actually been in nature for over 50 or 60 years. And that's like
wow.
hundreds of generations. So that's not something that they were remembering from a past lineage or time. And mind you, these mice are in captivity, so they're not having any expression
Mm,
to the external world. So I just think it's
mhm,
really interesting to show that even these mice kept in experimentation, there's something inherent to their physiology that they knew that when springtime comes,
mhm,
we reproduce. There's this energy that bursts and that comes. So it goes to show
mhm,
that this is something beyond just the temperature changes outside. This is something
mhm.
just beyond the actual barometric changes and pressure changes and things along those lines. There is something inherent in our physiology that changes due to the time of the year. And that's something that
Yeah.
I think that needs to become out of this realm of woo woo and actually become into just the operations of physiology itself.
Yeah, and what's amazing is like the ancestors of this medicine and of so many traditional wisdoms knew this. Like they
Mm-hmm.
knew so much that like this was the flow of energy, this is what's happening, this is what is felt like intuitively in your bones, in your body during this time, and this is just how you flow with the energy.
Yeah.
And I think that is a internal clock that is imprinted within each one of us from our ancestry, from these really ancient traditions and these cultures that knew that, when there's more sun during this point of the year, during springtime, that's when more people are more active. That's when the farmers are out planting the seeds and, seeing things bloom. It's like we're ready, attuned to this, like, this circadian rhythm within that's like connected to the global shifts. And I think we just need to remember that. And I do want to honor that we each do have our internal seasons. Like each person is on their internal winter or internal summer, or like they're kind of everyone, we're going through our own shifts at different times. And so we also do want to honor that like just because we're all in summertime, yes, we're experiencing that collective summertime like filter. I want to say I just makes me think of Leo season, because you so totally feel Leo season, like you're like, oh yeah, we're in Leo season, but in that time you could also be like, oh, but I'm feeling a little fall, like I'm feeling my inner fall, like where things need to be like go, or I need to be more discerning, or I need to get more new inspiration during this time. And so we do want to honor that. And also, before we move on from the wood element, I do want to say that like the other piece of the wood element, it's not just the liver, it's the gallbladder as well. the gallbladder is known as this, what we say as an extraordinary organ within Chinese medicine. What we know in Western medicine physiology is that the gallbladder is going to help break down fats. It's going to help, release bile, which helps to emulsify fats and, continue helping our body process, normally as it does. But I do really think that from an emotional and mental perspective, what Chinese medicine says about the gallbladder is rings so true. And because I've experienced it myself, the gallbladder is most related to our ability to make decisions and to take action, like to really go after something and take action. And when our gallbladder energy is imbalanced, then we tend to get a little timid. We tend to get a little indecisive. We get like a little hesitant. We don't really want to make, go after the big decisions that our liver planned out for us. And it doesn't want to take action fully on those things. And we bring that into also thinking about like if our gallbladder is not fully breaking down the fats that we're eating, like that could be kind of problematic, right, for our bodies. And so it's important that like we honor those aspects because we can sort of take on a lot, especially during springtime when like energy is higher. Being like, oh, I want to do all the things, but we do have to be on a level like learning to have boundaries during this time, learning to like say like, oh, this is what truly aligns with me and that's what my path is versus like taking on all the things which is possible during that springtime energy.
No, absolutely. It's like when you make plans when you're on like a high and like, oh, let's go here, let's vacation there, let's do this with friends, and
Yeah.
then you're like the next day, like, yeah, I just want to sit in my house and eat bonbons. Like, I didn't actually want to do any of those things. You got to be careful. You got to be
And
careful there for sure.
that's it's so important because the liver wants to be flexible. Like the liver is connected
Mm,
to blood, and when we have enough blood in our body, that's a big thing in Chinese medicine. That's when our energy is more flexible. We can kind of like shift and be adaptable. And I think when we put on too much in like in our springtime and then when it gets back into summer, we're like, oh shit, I don't know if I want to do all these things that I committed myself to? So it's
Well, and I
important
think that
that we
goes perfectly back to the conversation we were having because again, we were talking about liver and its, tendency towards alcohol. And if we look at
mm,
alcohol, especially if we're having lower consumption of it, the alcohol does assist in somewhat the movement of the liver in that sense. And so you can think about the state
yeah,
of being that someone is in after their first drink or two. They're in that state of like, let's go, let's explore, let's make communications with people, let's make plans. It's like you can see
yeah.
the activation of the liver in those initial stages of alcohol consumption because again we're
Right.
activating the system in those channels, and of course once you overdo it then you get into that state of over planning, overdoing, you not temperance yourself enough and overcommitting to things and being a little bit too open. But again, I think that
Mhm.
the alcohol is a perfect analogy not only for the negative side of alcohol because if people overconsume you can see the anger aspect of it, but it helps you understand the physiology in Chinese medicine of what the liver does because you know that
Mhm.
alcohol kind of assists in that process, so that can help you better understand it.
Totally, totally. This is not to say go drink alcohol so you can understand what the liver does,
One or
but
two experimentations top. You have to do it once, like that's
yeah.
okay, but don't overdo that.
Yeah, totally. And I think oftentimes if we do take on too much, that can cause a stagnation of energy as well. Like it's like it's like when you get to the too much, you're doing too many things, it causes the like the collapse, and it's like you don't want that to happen. You don't
Yeah,
want your body to go into that mode. It's like you have a to-do list, you create a to-do list and you're like stuck because you
yeah.
have too many things on the to-do list. So it's just about honoring the flow of energy and finding a balance. I mean, that's really the purpose and intention of Chinese medicine is that it's really there to find this balance in between yin and yang, to find this balance in between all these different elements and make sure that in our ecosystem of the body that the heart is communicating properly to the earth and the earth is properly communicating to the kidneys and the water system. It's like all of these pieces really need to be speaking to each other in harmony and in synchronicity. And so in order to have ourselves feeling authentic and vital and healthy. And so yeah, that's from a Chinese medicine perspective. We like to look at this five element system to really help people understand this is what your organs are saying. This is what we need to do and shift from a five element perspective. And I feel like it's really helpful for people to understand that. Like it gives people a whole nother
Yeah.
dimension to what their body is saying and doing.
No, and I think that that's a perfect segue into, how we usually wrap up here and like how do we utilize this to actually assist in our day to day. And, as
Yeah.
with our astrology episode, I kind of suggested, looking at the time of the year, seeing what sign that was associated with and see what those attributes are and see how those are expressed in you. I think that's another easy way
Mhm.
to use this five element cycle to better understand yourself and physiology is since we are, in the summertime right now, look into those characteristics. What is summer? What is fire?
Mhm.
What do we often associate? We associate this joy with this time of the year and reflect on what that
Mhm.
means to you and how you find joy in your life, how you balance joy in your life, how you seek these things out. And when we look at the physiology of things, bringing it back to the heart and small intestine, do you have any pathologies in either of these organs? Do you know what these organs actually do? Do you know what their purpose are? And, just kind of
Mhm.
glazing over those things and taking that by season and just kind of using that subtle understanding and knowledge to better understand. And last but not least, I think something important that you said was remember that even though we are in one of the elements and in one of the cycles, there is a smaller cycle of all five going on as well. We're always embodying all five of these things. You never want to go too far into other one because the whole point of this medicine is balance. So while you're focusing on your fire and your joy, make sure you are checking in your grief, in your fear, in your worry, in your
Mhm.
expression of frustration and anger, and all the benevolent aspect of all of those other organs. Because at the end of the day, if we stay too much in one thing, that's when burnout is reached. If we stay too much in one thing, that's when imbalance is reached. And at the end of the
Mhm.
day, by the definition of Chinese medical terms, when imbalance occurs, that's when we get pathology. And of course, that's what we're avoiding with the medicine and with these teachings.
I love the recommendations that you shared. I think it's such wisdom for just applying what we've learned today directly into the now. One other thing that I want to say is that, well, two things actually. If you are somebody that has a uterus and experiences a menstrual cycle, then you can also understand that your menstrual cycle, whether you're in follicular or
Mm-hmm.
luteal or in ovulation, those are also reflecting the seasons. Those are reflecting the elements. And so, like, let's just say ovulation is very much summertime. It's that fire time. It's like your energy is at the peak. That's when your hormones, right? You're having the most like estrogen during that time and the egg is being released. And so we need to also understand and honor like the cycles of our body. If you are somebody that identifies um and as a female and has a uterus, then like also realizing that there's another layer of cyclical wisdom inside of your body. And then also, I do want to say that because the five elements is applicable to the body, it's also applicable to your relationships. This is one other way that I love learning about five elements is like, how do humans behave? Like how do we relate as like as people in with each other? And when you are even in a friendship, a partnership, an intimate partnership, like with that other person or in this kind of unit, that unit experience cycles as well. So let's just say you begin to meet somebody, like you begin to date somebody, you're in that initial wood phase. Like you're in that initial like getting to know each other, things start to bloom. You're kind of like it's the infatuation. And then that moves you into the summertime where it's like, oh my, it's like it's fun and it's light and it's like you guys don't really know each other fully yet, but you're getting to know each other and things are still light and joyous and the infatuation is still there and you go on a lot of dates and all the things and then you get to the earth phase, which is like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you're like facing all the things and coming into reality and the practicality of what does it mean to be a unit with this person? What does it really mean? Like, can I see the reality of this person? Can I digest the emotions and the experiences that I have with this person? Like, what is that? What does that mean for me, and this person? And then that's usually kind of like the hard phase where you're like learning how to live with this person and like be in relationship with this person. And then you get into this metal phase where like it's more of an integrated love, and so you can actually apply these five elements to everything. And I love looking at it in relationships. So taking this and kind of stepping back and looking at your relationships and saying, "Oh, I wonder what phase we're in this time," and that gives you a lot of insight to like what you're going to move into the next season. And that can give you a lot of insight as well too, because you're like, oh, if we're going to go into the water season, we might find, we might end up kind of facing some fears together. Maybe there's some challenges. Okay, how can we build on some tools that can
Mm.
support ourselves during that time?
No, it's
So,
so beautiful that you kind of are ending here and how synchronistic our conversations always are because I was just at a wedding this weekend and one of the speeches actually ended with the seasons of a relationship. And they literally went over
uh-huh.
that, like that you started in spring and you moved to summer. And like, I was just sitting there and inside I was like, oh my God, this is Chinese medicine. This is Chinese medicine. This is Chinese medicine. And it's one of those experiences where like, especially as a practitioner, there's so many times where like someone says something either in symbolism or point something out, and like they're speaking
Yeah.
the medicine and don't even realize it. I think that's how
Yeah.
powerful this medicine is. It is applicable to so many facets and aspects of life that, again, just as a basic framework, is important and fun to have because you can utilize it and overlay it into any other conceptual construct, which you kind of pointed out there,
Totally.
and I think is important. But I think that's a
Totally.
perfect wrapping to the five elements, to the what we're discussing here, and how this structure is related.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us on this episode of talking about the five elements of Chinese medicine. Look forward to many, many more episodes on Chinese medicine. And without further ado, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
No, thank you.
Bye.